Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Reclaiming Shakti, Working with South Asian Women Survivors of Sexual Violence with Ashley Raju. Ashley is an Indian arts practitioner, a counselor in training, a sexual violence researcher, and a survivor. She advocates for South Asian survivors by sharing her research and consulting with health professionals and organizations to provide adequate care for South Asian women. She also advocates for Indigenous perspectives of healing and well-being to be valued and integrated into our work with families, communities, and individuals. She is currently involved with the Culture and Counseling paper at Messi University. Maharani Movement also offers Maharani Satsang, a full moon women's circle, and Maharani Sahayata, a support group for Brown folks working in the health and well-being sector. Through integrating Western perspectives to well-being with the use of mantra, yoga, and the chakras, we explore well-being through a holistic lens. And just a couple notes as we're all coming into the room, that you'll notice the chat box down at the bottom of your Zoom panel there. If you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat, and there'll be different times throughout the presentation in which Ashley will answer those questions. We'll also be doing breakout rooms about halfway through the presentation. And again, this will be recorded. You will all receive access to the recording, and we will also have it up on our website under the Anti-Oppression Resources page. And Ashley has also generously provided her beautiful PowerPoint presentation. So don't worry about trying to take too many notes or anything, just be present and enjoy her presentation, and you'll get all this info in the email we'll send afterwards. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ashley. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, Morena, Bula Vinaka, and Namaste. I'm Ashley, as Laura has beautifully introduced me. So welcome, and let's get started. So for today, we are just going to start off with some acknowledgements. I think it's important to acknowledge tangata whenua, who are the people of the land here in Aotearoa, from where I'm working and being with you today. And so before we get started, I'd just like to share a karakia, which is a prayer to start off our session together. Tēnei te ara o Ranginui e tuake nei. Tēnei te ara o Papatuanuku e takuto nei. Tēnei te ara o Rangi Rawa ko Papa e takuto nei. Kia raro te tapuai o tāne ki raro. Tēnei te pō, no mai te ao. Ka rangatia te ao e piri, ka rangatia ko tāne e piri e tata, whakamaua kia teina, teina, harie, tai ki e. Okay. So today because this is about the chakras and reclaiming Shakti, we will be starting off with mantra and some mindfulness at the beginning. So on that note, I invite you all to just come into your seat for a moment and really just focusing on where your seat is being supported today. And possibly lowering the eyes or closing the eyes if that feels accessible for you today. And just taking a few deep breaths here. Shri Ganeshaya Namaha. Om Shri Ganeshaya Namaha. Om Shri Ganeshaya Namaha. Om Saraswati Namastuvyam Vande Kamirupini Vidyarambham Kareshami Siddhi Bhavatu Me Sada. Om Bhur Bhuvah Swaha तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात्. And just gently bringing some movement into your bodies. So possibly just moving in circular motions and just focusing on your breath. And possibly moving the other way. And when you feel ready, gently opening your eyes and coming back to your space. So looking at the space around you, just coming back to your surroundings. Okay. Thank you for sharing space with me today. I want to acknowledge and honor that this is a really deeply personal topic to me. So I'm really grateful that you're here with me today. So today we are going to be talking about reclaiming Shakti and working with South Asian women survivors of sexual violence. We'll be going over some of the objectives for this webinar, and then I'll be sharing a little bit about what the chakra system is and why it's important as a framework of well-being. And then we'll move on to talking a little bit about my research and the framework that helps us kind of understand what the barriers and facilitators for healing are for South Asian women survivors of sexual violence. And I do want to be mindful that this is quite a heavy topic. So at any point during this presentation, if you need to take a moment just to kind of check in with yourself or practice some self-compassion, please do so. And we'll be here ready for you to come back. Okay. Right, so what is Shakti? Shakti is the energy within everything. It's the life force that sustains us and gives us life. And this is what we're reclaiming. So the reason that I wanted to open up the space with some mantra and Om actually is because for some of you, I'm not sure, but for me, this practice is actually a way for me to come back to my Shakti and to reclaim my Shakti. So the reason that we chant Om is actually because the Om sound is split into three syllables, three sounds, A, U, M. So the A sound, when we chant the A sound, that's actually stimulating and activating the dorsal vagal state. And as we move upwards to the U sound, we're moving towards the ventral vagal state. And the sound, which sits in here, which is our throat chakras, and then the silence after that, which is kind of, it's like a cycle. So we travel all the way from the root chakra, all the way up and back into the cosmos and back into silence before starting again. And the movement that we practiced earlier is to help us guide that Shakti, guide that energy from the root of us all the way to the crown. So I thought it would be really useful for us to do that practice so that before we get started, you know what I'm talking about, or at least you can kind of start feeling into it. So, webinar objectives. The first thing I want to say is let go of any expectation of success and cultural competency, please. So, the reason I say that is because even sitting here as a South Asian woman and a South Asian survivor, I could never claim to know the experiences of every South Asian survivor. And so I wouldn't ever claim to be culturally competent. What I can do is embrace cultural humility, because my perspective is drawn from my own experiences as well as the South Asian survivors who have become a part of my story. So by knowing their perspectives and their experiences, as well as the experiences of the survivors in my research and my own experiences, that's still only part of us. It's not everybody's stories. There is South Asian women are so diverse, and one of the problematic areas when we try and focus on cultural competency is that there is a risk of stereotyping and stigmatizing South Asian women by lumping them all together. But the fact is, South Asian women come from so many different countries. And so it's important for us to be mindful that we are constantly learning. And even as a South Asian survivor myself, I am constantly learning, because the different intersections of my identity inform my perspective. But the truth is that's not going to be true for everybody. And so I want to make it really clear that this Reclaiming Shakti framework is one perspective, and it's not a one size fits all. And so really embracing cultural humility. Another thing that I really want to get across is, before we get into the framework, just being mindful of any preconceived ideas we have about the high rate of sexual violence in South Asian communities being a result of us being uncivilized. The truth is that sexual violence is so prominent in our culture as a result of post-colonial harm. And now I don't have the capacity to go into that today. It's not my area of expertise. I do have a sister and a colleague who has done her thesis on this topic and knows a lot more about that, but this is not my area. But before I get into this, I do want to make it really clear that we don't have high rates of sexual violence in our community because we are old school. It's because there is so much trauma from colonization in our communities. So when we move towards embracing cultural humility, what does that look like? Cultural humility is moving forward with self-reflexivity while appreciating that each survivor's experiences and perspectives may be different. And when we practice cultural humility, we are integrating the willingness to share power with the survivor in order to learn from them. And so I think it's really important that we take a moment to really reflect on, okay, what do I know about this? How do I feel about this? How has this played out in my life before? And does this look different for me? Because when we're able to acknowledge our own culture, our own experiences, then we make room for the experiences and the culture of others. And I think that's really important in this work, is to remove that idea of ever being culturally competent, because we are always learning. And when we embrace cultural humility, we're able to collaborate more with the people that we work with. We're able to openly acknowledge, hey, I know this much, but I don't know all of it. Is this true for you or not? Would you like to share what is true for you or not? but just really owning the fact that we do really need to do our own work to learn. So throughout this presentation, we're going to be in breakout rooms. There's going to be 3 breakout rooms because I really want us to put that cultural humility into practice. So we will be talking about the physical needs of the chakra framework, and then I'll pop you into breakout rooms so you can have a little discussion around what that means for you, what that's looked like in your own lives, before we come back together to share. But really this is about practicing that self-reflexivity and hearing each other's perspectives, learning from each other with this willingness to sit with each other and learn your differences, learn your similarities. But that is really the only way to move forward if we want to be effective at working with South Asian survivors. So I would like one person from each group, once we come back from the breakout rooms, if you could give a little summary of whatever you're wanting to share in the chat, which I can read out for those who will be watching this later. And I also want to invite you to give yourself permission if you don't feel like sharing. So because this is deeply personal and it can bring up some stuff for people, if you don't feel comfortable sharing, please honor that, and no hard feelings. So just really looking after yourself. And we will be doing the breakout sessions after the physical needs. So the first 2 chakras, the Muladhara and Svadhisthana, root and sacral chakras. And then the second breakout session will be after the emotional needs. So looking at the solar plexus, heart and throat chakras. And then the third breakout room will be the spiritual needs. So the third eye and the crown chakra. Right, so let's get started. What is the chakra system and why is it important? So the 7 chakras, the 7 major chakras, are vibrational and movement-based energy centers within the body, and they're physically represented as starting from the root of the spine and moving upwards towards the crown of the head. Now, the word chakra actually means a spinning wheel or a spinning disc. So while there are 114 chakras and they originate from ancient India, today we're focusing on the 7 major chakras. And although on the slide I've written that they are physically represented as starting from the root to the spine, they are physical, emotional, spiritual, energetic. So for the purposes of this, I've divided the different chakras into physical, emotional, and spiritual. But I want to make it really clear that each of the chakras have all of these elements in them, which is why it is such a holistic model, because they are all interrelated and interconnected. And you can't really work on one without acknowledging the others. It's all parts of a whole. And so applying the chakras to conceptualize the journey to well-being for South Asian women survivors allows us the potential to facilitate healing at the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels for South Asian women survivors. So one of the reasons that this research focuses only on women is because there isn't enough research for survivors, South Asian survivors from the LGBTQI plus community. There's really enough research on this on South Asian women. So my research focuses on South Asian women because that is kind of the only research I could get my hands on at the moment. So we do need to be doing more of it, but I'm hopeful that we're slowly moving towards having our voices in the limelight rather than left in the margins. So let's talk about each of the chakras. So we have the root chakra, Muladhara, and that represents safety, trust, and security. So that's really our foundation. Moving upwards, the Sacral Chakra, which is really in this abdominal area and the pelvic area, that is Svadhisthana, the Sacral Chakra, representing creativity, pleasure, and desire. And moving upwards, in the solar plexus, we have Manipura. And this is our action center. It represents power and control. Moving further upwards is Anahata, which is our heart chakra. And this represents love, compassion, and forgiveness and peace. Also represents giving and receiving. Moving upwards is Vishuddha, our throat chakra. And this is around speaking one's truth and communicating, really just expressing one's authentic self. And that can look different for everybody. Moving upwards is our Arjuna, which is our third eye chakra. And this represents intuition, awareness, and the decisions that we make. It also talks a little bit about our guidance that we receive. And the last chakra is Sahasrara, our crown chakra. And this represents our connection to source, to spirit, to collective consciousness. And really it's this whole model that gets us mind, body, soul back into the universe, back to connecting with other people. And so this is why it's important, because a lot of the times when we're working with South Asian survivors, there are so many elements that goes into the journey to well-being. And if we are focusing solely on one part while not acknowledging the rest, then that can potentially cause further harm. And so really looking at it as a holistic model of different things affecting different chakras and blocking different chakras, because ideally what we want is this energy that we practiced right at the beginning around grounding and that Shakti. We really want it to move right from our root chakra all the way up to the crown chakra. And in order to do that, our chakras need to be open. But with a lot of the barriers, often some of the chakras end up blocked. And so we end up feeling these physical ailments in our body, or emotional consequences, I guess. So really just being mindful that the reason we're doing this is because we want that energy to flow through our survivors so that they can reclaim their Shakti. And I've popped in the spiritual laws for each of the chakras. Now at the end of this PowerPoint, which you will get your hands on, I have popped in a little article that kind of explains this further. So I'm not really going to go into this, but I will just briefly mention each of the spiritual laws for each of the chakras. So Muladhara, which is the law of karma. So that's your action. Svadhisthana, which is the law of least effort. So that's allowing yourself to surrender and be free and kind of not have to fight the world so much. So law of least effort. Manipura, law of intention and desire. It's our action center and where our willpower lives. So being able to set intentions and desires and go after them, this is the chakra for it. Heart chakra, Anahata, we have the law of giving and receiving. So can I give love and can I receive it too? And Vishuddha, law of detachment. So can I express myself regardless of the people around me, regardless of what they think or feel, or how they might feel about me sharing or being my authentic self. And Ajna chakra, law of dharma. So what is your purpose? What are you here to do? Reconnecting with your purpose of what you were sent here to do. And Sahasrara, crown chakra, is your law of pure potentiality. Are you stepping up to being who you were meant to be here? Right. And we have Muladhara and Svadhisthana are the physical elements of this framework. And now again, just want to make it clear that just for the purposes of this presentation, they are split into physical, emotional, and spiritual. But in fact, all of the chakras have each of these elements. So just really making that clear. So we have Muladhara, Svadhisthana, so I exist and I desire are the physical elements of this relationship for this framework. And together, they are the chakras which generate life. The emotional chakras, Manipura, Anahata, and Vishuddha, which is I control, I love, I express, they're emotional elements of this relationship. So Manipura is the center which sustains the generation of life. So again, you can start seeing how they're all interrelated, and it's difficult to just talk about one without including the others, because Muladhara and Svadhisthana root and sacral, while they generate life, Manipura is required to sustain it. And Vishuddha, the center of expression, which allows us to express this generation of life, and Anahata, the heart chakra, which symbolizes the merging of the lower 3 chakras and the higher 3 chakras. And then we have the last 2 chakras, the spiritual ones, Ajna and Sahasrara, third eye and crown, which is I witness and I am that I am. Again, just for this purposes, they are the spiritual elements of this relationship, and all the chakras have to be opened and aligned in order for the energy to flow from the root of the spine all the way to the crown, which is vital in the journey to well-being for South Asian women survivors. Right, so let's move on to the framework. Here it is. And so I've split them up into different themes at each of the chakras. So this is drawn from, so last year I completed my research project in counselling as part of my master's in counselling. And we did a systematic literature review. Again, there was about 12 studies, only 12 studies on this topic. So I've collated them all together, and it was really interesting because I really tried to find the themes and do the whole thematic analysis. And then one day I had like a download where everything just kind of fell into place, and I used the chakras because it was the only South Asian framework that really resonated with me. And the interesting thing is, once these themes came out and the framework was sitting in front of me, I actually did a lot of reflections and realized how this has actually been my journey to well-being as a survivor. And because I come from a collectivistic culture, naturally, I had to reach out to other South Asian survivors and talk to them to see whether this was true for them as well. And the most beautiful thing was when they read this, they went, yeah, this has been my journey to well-being. And this is put in a way that makes sense to us intuitively. And so the biggest struggle around this has been describing it and explaining it to non-South Asian folks, because to us it is something that's intuitively passed on. And so it doesn't really need to be broken down so much because it's in our blood, it's in our DNA. So for us, it just makes sense. So really what I'm here is trying to communicate this intuitive knowledge, this indigenous knowledge that has been passed down from our ancestors in our blood, in our DNA, and our genes, and communicate it in a way that hopefully makes sense to people who haven't had this passed down to them. So, Muladhara, root chakra. So throughout each of these chakras in the framework, I am going to be sharing a quote from the research that was used in my systematic review. It can potentially be triggering. So again, just another invitation for you to give yourself permission to do what you need to look after yourself. And just remember that while these quotes might be enraging, It is not because our culture is problematic. This is trauma. This is post-colonial harm. So I really encourage you to reflect on any stereotypes or attitudes that are coming around blaming South Asian culture, because we need to be moving towards how do we heal from this post-colonial harm. So the quote, in the Asian community, they don't talk about it. They don't even think that it exists. What they say, which I can't believe, is that it doesn't happen to us. It happens to white people because that's what they are like. It doesn't happen to Asian people. No Asian person ever gets abused. And that's from Gill and Harrison's study in 2019. So what are the themes at this chapter? We have 4 themes: fear, culture, survival, and safety. And so this attitude that it doesn't happen to us in South Asian communities, it is a physical external factor that contributes to the fear of disbelief that South Asian survivors experience. So one of the reasons that there's a huge reluctance to report or disclose sexual violence in our community is due to the fear of being punished or retaliated against or told to stay silent to protect family izzat, which is honor. So izzat, I'm actually going to talk about in the solar plexus chakra because it really deserves its own topic. But this belief around the fears that are very real fears for South Asian women survivors, and also the fact that people believe it doesn't happen in our communities. This really contributes to victim blaming attitudes that are experienced within our communities. And so because of this fear of being blamed as a survivor, this fear of being punished or having consequences or retaliated against or told to stay silent is a huge reason why people struggle to report or ask for help or even disclose. Another really important factor is that currently there are inadequate attempts to acknowledge non-Western ideals about the self. And so what I mean by that is in South Asian communities, because we are collectivistic cultures, selfhood is always embedded within relationships, whether that is with family or the community. But often practitioners try to impose really individualistic ideals of selfhood, which actually perpetuates further harm, because a lot of the times we struggle to share or disclose is because we have this genuine fear of either bringing shame to our family or disappointing our family, or what will our family think? What will our community think? I can't hurt them. I need to protect them. And so being treated in this way of coming from an individualistic culture, it does harm to us because we rely on that community. We rely on family to support us. Those relationships are really important. They help us be us. They make our sense of identity. So there is this really, it is important to acknowledge non-Western ideals about the self. And that's not only for South Asian communities, that's for a lot of Indigenous communities. And, you know, I would really like to caution you against imposing Western ideals of selfhood onto survivors who are seeking help. And this is where it's really important for practitioners, especially white practitioners, to do the work and, you know, practice self-reflexivity so that you can start learning about what is my culture, what are the core values in my culture, and how may that be different in other cultures. Because the more we learn about ourselves, the better we are at connecting with others. Because if we don't do that work to learn more about ourselves and reflect on what are our cultural values, what are our personal values, then we don't really make a lot of room in our life to hear the values of others, to hear how the beliefs and attitudes and how others live their life. So again, coming back to that cultural humility, self-reflexivity is just a lifelong thing that we all need to start practicing, myself included. So we've talked a little bit about the fear, and I guess on the slide we've got, it is crucial to be aware of one's ethnicity, especially white practitioners, and to reduce the possibilities of fetishizing our culture. So Western feminism and white practitioners have actually been criticized for often stereotyping South Asian women as submissive, silent, in need of saving. And this actually stems from an inadequate understanding of South Asian culture, because South Asian women are actually incredibly resilient. We are strong. We have known how to keep ourselves safe for a very long time. So there is nothing submissive or in need of saving there. We've been doing that our whole lives. But often, because we're labeled as submissive or silent, and this being seen as weak, there is this tendency for people to want to step in and save us, but that's actually doing more harm. And it also fails to account for the diversity of South Asian women survivors. There are some survivors who are staying silent to keep safe, to stay safe, and that is the resilience strategy that they're using. So that is power in itself. And then there are South Asian survivors who are using their voices, who are advocating and speaking up for those who can't yet speak up, because we're in a position to do so. And that is also powerful, but neither is better or worse than the other. But failing to account for the diversity of us does a lot of harm. And I've written a little bit about cultural concepts. So Izzat, Sharm, and Haya. Izzat is honor, Sharm is shame, and Haya is modesty. So I will talk about them when it comes to the solar plexus chakra, because they're more relevant there. But I do want to mention that currently Western translations of these cultural concepts fail to include the complexities of Izzat, Sharm, and Haya. So a deeper understanding of what these terms mean in South Asian culture is actually required, and we will explore that a bit later on. When it comes to culture, upon seeking help, the effects of sexual violence often become translated into symptoms of mental disorder. So sexual violence has consequences for emotional, mental, physical, family, and spiritual health. But when South Asian survivors go to seek help, often they are given a list of labels and a number of different diagnoses without any acknowledgement of how all of these different ways of responding, ways of keeping safe, the way that the nervous system has responded to the trauma, how they all interconnect to create the effects of sexual violence. And so it's really important to look at them as all being parts of a whole, so that we don't just give people a bunch of labels and then they're walking around going, cool, this is my list of things that are wrong with me. So making that move towards focusing on what is strong, not what is wrong with survivors. Now, when it comes to survival, immigration and assimilation to Western culture are also barriers to seeking help for South Asian survivors. So, for example, for people who have recently migrated to a country, they might be unfamiliar with the legal rights in the new country. There might be language barriers, as there's a huge focus on having things in English, but a lot of us might not speak English. There's also a heavy push towards our ability to speak English and be able to translate our experiences into a language that is not our go-to to explain how we're feeling. And so that's a huge barrier, because in order for practitioners to support survivors, practitioners often rely on the fact that the survivor will be able to translate their experiences into the language of the practitioner. But, that can actually be quite harmful, or it acts as a barrier because people go, well, they're not going to understand me anyway. I can't actually describe my experiences adequately in English, so I'm just not going to go. And there is this huge fear on the consequence of reporting if people are waiting on their immigration status. And so a big reason why people don't report is because they are waiting for visas or whatever it is, and they don't want to risk that. And so it's easier to be quiet in that sense, to stay safe, to stay in this new country, than to kick up a fuss, for a lack of better words. And individuals are also having to manage racism in addition to healing. Now, this is quite big. Definitely had to sit with this for a moment. But because a lot of the time survivors are having to deal with racism, it's actually too risky to disclose or ask for help and risk being ostracized from the families or from communities, because we are collective beings. We need our communities. We need the base from where we recharge and feel home and connect. And if we are out in the world having to deal with racism constantly, and we risk losing that, then we've got nowhere. So for some survivors, the choice to not disclose does stem from, well, at least then I still have a place to belong. At least then I still have a group of people to belong to. So really being mindful of the experiences that are happening for South Asian survivors before they even get into your space to start working with you, to start disclosing. Because it's also a lot of emotional labor having to do this work, having to commit to healing while also having to manage racism, manage these systematic issues that really affect us, and risk ostracization. It's just, for some, it's not possible unless they have a supportive community. And lastly, for some South Asian women survivors, seeking help while remaining in the environment where the harm occurred, that could be potentially dangerous. So I think it's really important that anybody working with South Asian survivors checks in with what home environment they're in. What is it like at home? What are the very real fears for these survivors? Are they going to be safe if they disclose? Are there steps that need to be taken to make sure that the survivor is safe at home so that they can do this healing? Because if we push survivors to start doing the healing, but home isn't safe, then we are potentially setting them up for harm, for more harm or danger. And so just really taking stock and checking in with safety is really key. We've talked about Muladhara, and now it's time to move to the Sacral Chakra, Svadhisthana. So the quote here: I didn't tell my mum that he raped me. He told my mum that she won't let me anywhere near her. And my mum turned around and said to me, you are his mattress, you will do as he wants. And that was my mum. She goes, you've made your bed, you lie in it. You are his mattress. From Gill and Harrison, 2019. So this really highlights the attitudes and the sexual conditioning for women and men in South Asian communities. So socialization around sexuality and men have to be acknowledged and understood in order to empower and facilitate healing for South Asian women survivors. So for women, this conditioning includes the concept of haya, which is modesty, and that prevents women from speaking about sex, let alone sexual violence. It also monitors how women dress, how women speak, women's actions, all of it. We are taught to cover up and be careful of what we say, be careful of how sexual you are, how sensual you are. And in some South Asian communities, sexuality is only acceptable within the confines of marriage for women. Women have to remain virginal to produce legitimate heirs for men. And we are taught that women's desires are unimportant, which contributes to marital rape. And being taught that their desires are unimportant means that many South Asian survivors actually don't recognize these things as sexual violence. And you see it in the quote, actually, this attitude of what the mum said to her own daughter around, this is just how it goes. You've made your bed, you lie in it. So again, it really reinforces this idea that once you were married, your desires do not matter. You give your husband what he wants. So a lot of this sexual conditioning is actually where we need to be looking to create some change. Whereas the sexual conditioning for men, you can see in the slides, is very different. The socialization of men concerning sexuality is that men are raised to believe that sex is their masculine right, and they are also given the power to manipulate women's reproductive rights. That's it, those two things. So you can really see the imbalance between the attitudes that we get told, the beliefs and the conditioning that are passed on to us, and then the conditioning that is passed on to the men. So a lot of work needs to go in around really challenging that. And yeah, I'm hopeful, but it is work that we all need to be doing together. Right, so are you following along? I just want to take a little pause here because I know that when we talk about the chakras, it can be quite overwhelming. There is a lot of information to take in there. So I just want to take a little pause here and see if you've got any questions and whether you'd like to pop them into the chat. And this is before we're going to go into a breakout room for you all to kind of have a little korero around what do the chakras that we've talked about mean for you? And this is a way of us practicing our self-reflexivity. Oh, can you say more about what to discuss? Yes, good question. Okay, so we are going to be discussing this here. So if you can screenshot or take a photo on your phone, because you won't be able to see the slide once you're in the breakout room. So I invite you to reflect on I exist and I desire. So have you grown up with any of these external influences, as in the fear, survival, safety, and cultural values that have been passed on to you? And what have you been taught about having desires and following pleasure? So if you take a photo of this, I have put a summary of the root chakra and the sacral chakras here as well. And we'll start popping you into breakout rooms. As you start coming back, I invite someone from each of the groups to just pop in the chat a little summary of maybe things that you talked about or reflections that you'd like to share, just so that I can read them out for the people who are going to be watching this later, so they won't have a group to do this in. So yeah, so just pop that into the chat if you feel up to it. Okay, so we discussed suppressing desires as a form of control and taking our power back as the healing. I can really resonate with that. Themes from our chat were around control and conditioning, be that within families or religion or society. Our hope is that it is changing now. Yes, I hope so too. And I guess this is us being part of it, trying to challenge this and change this together. Growing up feeling like our needs didn't come first or don't matter. Women have to serve. Oh, I really feel that, yeah. And I guess this is part of how we are changing that, right? Having these conversations in the first place. How men aren't told what to do in a marriage, just that they need to be married. Catholics. Ooh, that's really, thank you for sharing that, because that's really helpful for me as well, because obviously I'm not a man and I'm not Catholic, so I don't really know those experiences. I'm told what to do in a marriage. So a little bit of like conversations and education around what does it look like to be married, how we treat our partners, how we are in relationships is needed. Discussed about still some of the rituals in India is considered as honor rather than control. Yes. And we're going to talk about honor in the next chapter, actually, honor and control, actually. I exist was about feeling more in our bodies, feeling safe in our bodies, also about feeling connected to something bigger than ourselves. Also connection to others in a safe and boundaried way. Yes. In our group, we discussed matters like we want to feel our body like it's our home and feel safe in it. That healing and integration of how to honor needs, how to honor our needs. Yeah, so that's really looking at safety in the body and learning that we're allowed to have needs. We're allowed to acknowledge them and honor them. We used the time to get to know each other, and of course the reason we were drawn to your presentation, a common acknowledgement of how important our extended energy is to our physical healing. Yes. Yes, it's not just about the physical work that needs to be done. It's about using a holistic approach and looking at us as holistic, as whole beings. Oh, I love that. Okay, thank you for sharing. All right, so let's continue. I just want to celebrate you all for actually opening up and sharing and participating and engaging. I really appreciate it because I can't see your faces as I'm presenting this. So it feels nice to know that there are humans on the other end of it. Okay, so share screen. All right, let's continue. Alrighty, so just coming back to the summaries, which you've all talked about. So let's move on. Right, so we're moving up to the emotional chakras for the purposes of this research or this framework. So we have Manipura, our solar plexus chakra, and just a reminder that this is our control center. This is our action center. It's also our emotional center. So the quote here, the role of a woman in the South Asian family, especially for young women, is to be very pure, very virginal. When I was abused, it was during the time that my parents were interested in arranging a marriage for me. So I felt not only violated within myself, but I felt like my being raped destroyed my family's virginal status too, so to speak. It was just a double blow, and I felt like I let my family down by what had occurred to me because I felt that I had brought this upon myself. So here we're really starting to hear the things around, is it honor? and shadam, shame, and letting our families down, letting our communities down, letting people down, and really feeling like we had brought this upon ourselves, which obviously we didn't. Nobody ever asked for it, and it is never our fault. So izzat and shadam, honor and shame, are two of the most influential barriers to disclosure of sexual violence. Izzat, unlike Western understandings, is not a quality, it's a possession. So in Western culture, honor is seen as a quality that everyone has, that it's part of you. Whereas in South Asian communities, izzat is actually a possession. So you were given your izzat, and as soon as you do something that risks bringing shame to the family, that izzat is taken away. And there is this belief that once honor is lost, once izzat is lost, it can't be repaired. And so shadam, the shame, is actually the consequence of the removal of honor. So in Western understandings of shame, it is seen as an emotion. But in South Asian communities, shame is seen as a consequence of that removal of honor. And so you can start seeing how important it is to really learn more about these concepts, because if we look at other cultures, or if we look at South Asian culture with our own understanding of what these concepts mean to us, we're not going to be able to really connect and understand what it might be like for the other person. And in South Asian communities, daughters and women are responsible for their family izzat, family honor. Women are blamed for losing their izzat, not the abuser. Shadam is an expression and consequence of the loss of izzat, unlike the Western emotion of shame. And in South Asian communities, shame actually ripples out to the family, especially the female siblings. And I think that's quite unique to South Asian communities, and possibly also some other Asian communities as well. And so speaking about sexual violence, speaking about sex full stop, brings shame to the individual and the family. So moving on to control. So a few of you actually talked about control in your reflections. Control and power are interconnected. Women are controlled by families to maintain this family image, uphold family izzat, family honor, which contributes to control over women's bodies and behavior. So women may often be seen as the property of men. There are these gendered expectations within marriage that pressure women to hold the marriage together. And so what that can look like is the woman needs to do anything and everything to keep that marriage together. Again, that can contribute to marital rape. And there's also a lack of control for women over their own reproductive rights. So this is where male entitlement and strict gender socialization and those family roles, they come in and they really reinforce the power dynamics that oppress women. So this lack of power can contribute to feeling powerless and helpless for South Asian survivors, which can also be a barrier to seeking help. And now if we think about this chakra, if this is our control center, this is our willpower, this is where we take action, but we're feeling powerless and helpless, how are we supposed to move forward? How are we supposed to take action? You know, we're always hearing these things of ask for help, speak out, go to therapy, go get help, go access help. But if this is blocked and we don't have that willpower open and available to us or accessible to us, and we're feeling powerless and helpless, how do we go out and ask for help? How do we go out and ask for our needs to be met? So it's something to really think about and reflect on. So we're moving up to Anahata, the heart chakra. And so Anahata, like, quite literally means unstuck, or the translation means unstuck. So I'll read you the quote here. It is interesting that my life has taken me to work on the issues of child sexual abuse, because previously I didn't really kind of get its own relationship to my life. I had to go back and look underneath my experiences and see how my experience of child sexual abuse really affected who I am, affected my relationships, affected my life. So, talking about child sexual abuse, it helps me move from my abuse and has moved me to a better place. And that's from SIN's research in 2010. So what are the themes at this chakra? Grief, self-love and self-compassion, resilience and empowerment. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to think about is grief that's in here, but so does self-love and self-compassion. So does resilience and empowerment. But a lot of the times for South Asian survivors, or possibly survivors, it's hard to access that self-love and self-compassion, that resilience and empowerment, if the grief is blocking it. And so often for survivors, we're either given these messages around that happened so long ago, just forget about it, or like, that's in the past, just let it stay in the past. And so these messages that teach us, actually, my grief is not allowed here. I'm not allowed to grieve. Or the classic, I guess, thing that trauma does, where it tells you, oh, they had it worse than me, so mine doesn't matter. And so not being given these opportunities around talking about it and feeling the grief, feeling the loss of the life that you thought you would have, feeling that pain that actually occurred from sexual violence, not being allowed to feel those things, like, contributes to us wrapping that grief up and putting it in a box. But then that becomes a barrier for us to tap into loving ourselves, being compassionate towards ourselves. Because why would you be compassionate towards yourself? Why would you love yourself if you don't think you're deserving of those things? And unless we make that shift to learn, oh, what happened to me wasn't okay, I'm allowed to grieve this, then and only then can we start practicing the self-compassion of, yes, I am actually deserving of love and compassion. I'm allowed to look after my needs. I'm actually strong. I survived this. And then comes empowerment. But in order to be able to do any of that, we need to normalize grieving. We need to normalize talking about these things. And even if it happened so far in the past, it's still worth grieving, because your story matters. Our story matters. So just have a look. Yeah, practicing love and self-compassion builds resilience and empowerment. And so how this grief may manifest when survivors, if survivors are starting to seek help or first seeking help, a lot of the times it can look like reluctance and hesitation. And this is largely due to izzat and sharam, honor and shame, reinforcing that belief that their experience is not worth grieving. And, again, because there are victim blaming attitudes and minimizing attitudes, a lot of the times we've just learned to keep it quiet, keep it hidden, because it's not allowed. So, yeah, normalizing grief removes barriers faced by South Asian women survivors to facilitate self-love and self-compassion. in order to build resilience and empowerment. You can read through the slides at a later stage because I've mostly talked about this stuff. I will like to talk about this quote though, and how talking about child sexual abuse, it helps me move from my abuse and has moved me to a better place. So once we're allowed to grieve, once we're allowed to practice self-love and self-compassion, can move us towards resilience and empowerment. And a lot of the times, survivors, that resilience and that empowerment starts looking like advocacy, social advocacy. I mean, I would like to put my hand up and say, hello, here I am, but I know I'm not the only one. There are other South Asian survivors who are doing just this. Because once we realize, actually, this wasn't okay, I didn't ask for this, and this is not my fault, we can actually see that for others as well. And we do, because we are in a position to be able to own that and share that, we do take up that mantle of making sure that other South Asian survivors also know that. And so social advocacy really also feeds into that resilience and empowerment for South Asian women survivors as we start reaching out for help and understanding the impact of having spaces where South Asian survivors can share their grief, can share their stories, and really create this social support. Because if we remember earlier, I talked about many South Asian communities being collectivistic cultures. And so that support, that social support is so important for us, because you can't do this work in isolation. You know, a lot of the times trauma survivors really just need an empathetic witness. I think that's what Judith Herman says, yeah? So once we start experiencing this social support in this community, the energy at the heart chakra starts opening up, starts flowing, and we start integrating the lower chakras and the higher chakras, which facilitates healing on the journey to well-being. Let's move up towards the throat chakra, Vishuddha, and I'll read you the quote. The reason that I'm talking about it is because I want to stop it. More people should come out with their stories, and having more people come out with it will mean the people who are doing it will be more hesitant, because in our culture, they know that nobody talks about it. They know that they won't say, so they take advantage of this. They know that the position that they are in means no one is going to question them, and they can turn around and say, I know who they're going to believe. Again, Gillian Harrison, 2019. So the themes at this chakra: communication, asking for help, and speaking one's truth. This also includes I express, and communication, asking for help, and speaking one's truth are kind of themes that come out of being able to safely express oneself. And so a lack of disclosure and reporting is again due to the victim blaming attitudes in our community, minimization and marginalization of our survivors. There's also a lack of trust in the police. We don't feel safe enough to go to the police to talk to them. That's largely due to language barriers and the belief that police are all men. And while this is inaccurate, many police are white males, and I actually don't have the capacity to talk about the police. So I'm going to leave you to read that slide in your own time. But building trust is vital to asking for help. And that's got to be from the police and from helping professionals from organisations and agencies who claim to support survivors. And encouraging South Asian women survivors to ask for help from people they trust and know will understand their experiences can be empowering. So what I mean by this is if we have a culture of silence where we're not allowed to talk about it, when there are South Asian survivors who are talking about it, let's support them, because they are the survivors who likelihood is that they have a greater chance of understanding or relating to the experiences of their fellow South Asian survivors, keeping in mind that we are diverse and there are so many different perspectives and experiences for survivors. But what I mean here is when a South Asian survivor connects with another South Asian survivor, there is less emotional labor that needs to be done for us to explain our culture, how our family works, family, community dynamics, relational dynamics, all of that, which is often what we have to do in order to seek help. And so really having these spaces facilitated by South Asian survivors and a culture where we're not allowed to talk about it is a way of challenging that. Because a lot of the times we just need representation. We just need to see, oh my God, if they are doing this, maybe I'm allowed to as well. And so the energy from the throat chakra requires South Asian survivors to trust that they can express themselves in order to ask for help, to be able to communicate and speak their truth. And this allows us to start moving towards the higher spiritual chakras. So I hope you're following along. Let's take a small pause again here. And to see if any of you have any questions that you'd like to pop into the chat before we move out to the second breakout session. Yeah. So again, I invite you to take a photo of this or a screenshot or whatever is going to make it easier for you to remember this. I've written down the summaries of the 3 chakras that we've talked about here. And these are your reflections. So I control, I love, I express. What is your understanding of honor and shame? What is it like to learn about silence as a resilience strategy? I'm actually not sure if we necessarily went over that in this set. And just a reminder that a lot of the times for South Asian women, we're seen as weak and submissive and vulnerable, right? But the truth is, silence is one of our resilience strategies. We know who to tell our story to in order to keep safe. We know when to share our story if it's safe for us to share our story. And that is huge resilience on our part, because we have learnt what we need to do in order to keep us safe. But there is this huge push for silence being seen as us being weak or submissive, which is not the case at all. So I really want you to reflect on what is it like to learn about silence being a resilience strategy of South Asian women. And do you have spaces where you can authentically express yourself? So just take a screenshot of this and stop share. Okay, so let me know if there are any questions. Otherwise, we can just pop you into your breakout rooms. Okay, so again, I invite you to post your reflections on here. Post your reflections in the chat so I can read out for anybody watching later. Also just want to be mindful of the time. We probably will go over a little bit, so I'm going to leave the last breakout session just so that we can try and finish up close to time. So start posting your reflections in the group chat. So for anyone who's just re-entered the room, we're just posting the reflections in the group chat so I can share with the rest of the group. We discussed our spaces and how important they are, and the shorthand that does develop between the individuals within the group, and how comforting that is, how critical it is to have that space. I'm really grateful that you've taken that from this so far, because I am, again, an advocate for South Asian survivors and really advocating for us to have our spaces, because a lot of the research that is done on sexual violence is based on Western populations and Western scholars and Western research. So I think it is really important for us to have our own space and our own research and our own ways of working. We discussed how silence is a resilient strategy, but being silenced does not seem to have the same quality. So here I hear that difference between using silence as a resilient strategy, which is a choice that we make to keep ourselves safe, but when that choice is imposed on us, then that is harmful. We discussed silence as both empowerment and as disempowered, depending on context and tension, and touched on masculine, feminine energy fluctuation as a result of trauma. So again, really hearing that when the choice is to be silent, the choice is what we've made for ourselves, that can be empowering, but when it's enforced on us, then that is disempowering, absolutely. And the masculine, feminine energy fluctuation. So we're talking about some Tantra principles here and the need to have that balanced, because we can get stuck in either or. We talked about the need to be in control to stay safe. Finding it hard to grasp the concept of honor in Western culture, but understanding shame and how some of us have used silence as a resilience mechanism to certain levels, but how it can also be detrimental to your well-being when you bottle up. Absolutely. Yes. So again, I'm really hearing that choice to be silent is different to being made to be silent. Thank you. Again, just want to acknowledge and celebrate you all for really engaging and participating. I really appreciate that. So let's move on. So we'll move to the last two chakras, Arjuna Chakra, the third eye chakra, and Sahasrara, the crown chakra. So I am just going to get rid of the breakout session for this lot, just because I do want to honor the time that you've set aside for being here with me today. But what are the themes at this chakra? Arjuna Chakra is awareness and guidance. So the quote here, she was sexually abused by both her uncle and her brother, and she stated that she somehow deserved the abuse. She had not been taught to value her body as her own. And this is from Singh's research in 2010. So what this quote really highlights is the sexual conditioning that we talked about in the Sacral Chakra, and how a lot of the times we're actually not taught what sexual violence is. We're not taught that we have control and authority over our own bodies, that we're allowed to choose what we want to do with our bodies. And so really having a focus on education and awareness raising within South Asian communities with potential offenders, with faith groups and representatives who hold power is absolutely necessary for us to start shifting this awareness that we have in our community. Women not recognizing marital rape or abuse as sexual violence also contributes to underreporting, and it also delays help seeking. And so religion and religious leaders may be influential in this awareness of marital rape, and therefore bringing them into this space and encouraging them to be part of this awareness raising in our community is also really important, along with bringing in representatives who hold power. So really raising awareness of what sexual violence is and teaching South Asian women that their body is theirs alone, and providing the appropriate guidance are facilitators for the journey to wellbeing for South Asian women survivors. we can also draw in the resilience of South Asian women survivors who are engaging in social advocacy, which I described in the heart chakra as being potential facilitators for awareness raising and the journey to well-being for South Asian women. So these survivors who are engaging in social advocacy, they may become role models for making positive changes for others in the world. And so this is really important, where we bring in these community mentors or use these big sister advocates to really push for what it is that South Asian survivors need. This guidance also allows South Asian survivors someone to see who is out in the world, who is sharing the experiences that might be similar to them and talking about it in a culture of silence. So all of a sudden there's someone who's talking and challenging this culture of silence, which can be permission giving to survivors who've been taught that this is something that we don't talk about. And so it's really important to bring in South Asian survivors into this space to possibly facilitate support groups if they have the capacity, bring them into agencies and working alongside the police and agencies and health professionals to build this bridge, because survivors don't necessarily trust the police and health professionals and agencies. So bringing in a survivor who is in a place of their healing where they're engaging in social advocacy can really help build this bridge between survivors and agencies, because awareness and guidance are vital to the journey of well-being and integrating the physical, emotional, and spiritual elements of healing. Let's move to the crown chakra, Sahasrara. And here we have spiritual connections and holistic care and prevention and support. Just the quote here: reconnecting to the South Asian community after child sexual abuse really brought me to tears, because it made me realize how important it was. See, I was still a member of that community as an individual. And not only that, I still wanted to belong. I needed to reconnect. I could not survive outside of the community. And that's from Singh's research in 2010. So what this really highlights is the collectivistic nature of South Asian communities. And so spiritual connections with other South Asian survivors, access to holistic care, which includes the mind, body, and soul, spirit, and increasing prevention and support, which is drawn from South Asian research, South Asian culture, South Asian models of well-being, are necessary for the collective consciousness of South Asian communities. We need a holistic approach which incorporates the different factors that affect us on our journey to well-being. And this support really needs to be coordinated. So this is police and agencies and health professionals and survivors all working together, because we're not just parts of ourselves, we're whole selves, and that needs to be honored and celebrated and acknowledged, so that we can feel safe enough to trust that being all that I am is allowed in this world, that being my authentic self is allowed in this world. Being my authentic self will still allow me to experience community and collective healing. And the way we do that is really by creating spaces for South Asian survivors to come together and hear each other's stories, which is empowering in itself, because that's how we break this culture of silence. So again, introducing community mentors to bridge the gap between South Asian women survivors and agencies will facilitate the building of trust, which is necessary for us to engage in help seeking. And that social advocacy that we talked about in the heart chakra, this could lead to survivors setting up support groups. But we need to be supporting these survivors who are doing this work, because those relationships are so important. And so for so many of us, when we see someone as a big sister, we feel like we can go to them to ask for help. We feel like we can go to someone who understands us, understands our backgrounds, understands our culture. And it takes away that emotional load of having to explain, justify, and validate, and allows us just to be. And coming back to one of the comments that you made, the reflections around the masculine and the feminine energies, the lunar and the solar energies, that surrender, that being, we're so focused on the doing, which is really that solar energy. But we also need space to come out of that and go into lunar energy and just be and surrender and sit and flow. And that can only happen when we have our own spaces. So yeah, supporting the survivor mentors as big sisters really draws on that spiritual connections that is necessary for the crown chakra. Again, just talking a little bit about the importance of the coordinated approach and holistic approach, but I'll leave you to read that in your own time. So I will hold the space for any questions that anybody has. We won't be moving out to the breakout room for this session just because I want to be mindful of time, but possibly using this opportunity to just reflect quietly for yourself. What is the role of community and spiritual connections in your life? Are you able to regularly connect with others who are like you? And do you see others who look like you advocating for you out in the world? And the reason that I ask these questions is because for many of us South Asian survivors, the role of community and spiritual connections is so important in our lives. But often we're not able to regularly connect with others who are like us because we're not given those spaces. Those spaces aren't created. Those spaces aren't supported. Or for survivor advocates who are trying to create those spaces, they're not supported. We're not supported. And we don't see others like us who are advocating for us out in the world. So it really makes a difference. So if you have any questions, I invite you to pop them in the chat. You can take a photo of this if it helps. I'm about to stop the screen share in about 3 seconds. So either screenshot or take a photo. So I'll give you the opportunity to share if you would like to in the group chat, and permission to not to if you don't feel comfortable sharing, that's also okay. And then we'll move to closing the space and finishing up. So just give you a few moments in case anybody does have questions. All right, so we will move on. Oh, do you also do yoga that is supported and intentionally made for survivors that goes alongside with this chakra system? So there is trauma-informed yoga, which there are people, so I don't personally do that yet, because I'm still in the final year of my master's, but that is actually what I'm hoping to do from next year. But there are spaces, and there is, let me just write her name down, who I know of who does this training and does run a lot of programs for survivors using trauma-informed yoga. One moment, please. So she is in the States, and she does a lot of trauma-informed yoga that uses the chakra system for survivors. And so definitely recommend looking into her work. Okay, so let's move on. If there are no more questions, we'll move on to the final slides and wrap up. Oh, thank you. Okay. Right. So the realities. So just some food for thought here. So I've talked about the framework based on my own research, which I completed last year. But Gilligan and Akbar's 2006 study did argue that adequate change in culturally competent policy was needed almost 15 years ago. And yet, in a study done in 2018, they noted that little change had been made. And I did my research in 2020, and again, the story continues that adequate change in culturally competent policy is desperately needed. There is a lack of funding and investment and support services for South Asian women survivors, and there is this huge government focus on the criminal justice response. So that's really pushing survivors to report and to disclose and take legal action. But there is not funding and investment and support services for survivors. Just a little bit of food for thought for you. So coming back to the Reclaiming Shakti framework, we have gone over all of these themes and how they relate back to each of the chakras. But you will note that the role of trust is essential to healing. And so when it comes to the root chakra, I exist, there needs to be trust around it is safe enough for me to exist. When it comes to the sacral chakra, I desire, there needs to be trust built around it's safe for me to have desires. Again, when it comes to Manipura, the solar plexus chakra, there needs to be trust around I'm allowed to control, I'm allowed to be in control, and that requires trust. Same with the heart chakra, I love. We need to trust, we need to be able to trust that it's safe enough for us to love. And the same goes for throat chakra, I express. We can only express if there is trust that it is safe for us to express, that me expressing isn't going to get me ostracized, that me expressing is allowed. And so really just highlighting that and how important trust is in each of these chakras. Same with I witness. If we're not getting the appropriate awareness and guidance, how can I trust what I'm witnessing? How can I trust the awareness and guidance that I'm receiving? Because it doesn't look like it's made for people like me. So I can't trust that what I'm witnessing is right for me. And the same with the crown chakra. I am that I am. How can I be I am all that I am if I haven't been taught or learned that it is safe enough for me to be all that I am? So you can really start seeing how trust underpins every chakra and every theme here. And right now, there is a huge lack of trust for South Asian survivors because we just don't receive the support that we desperately need. So let's just do a quick summary of the physical, emotional, and spiritual elements of the framework and of what we've talked about today. So the first two chakras, Muladhara, Swadhisthana, they really relate to the physical and external needs of South Asian women survivors. We lack trust in our ability to safely exist and desire. So establishing that trust is vital in understanding the role that culture, security, fear, and safety plays in our lives, the role that sexual conditioning plays when addressing the physical needs of South Asian women survivors of sexual violence. When we talk about the emotional needs, Manipura, Anahata, Vishuddha, solar plexus, heart, and throat, they correspond to these internal emotional needs and really highlight our needs and highlight the lack of trust that we have and the ability to regain control in our lives, to love and express ourselves. Izzat and Shadim, honor and shame, they need to be deconstructed in order for survivors to regain power and control in their own lives and our own lives. And trust needs to be established in order for South Asian women survivors to begin grieving what has happened to us, so that we can turn inwards towards that self-love, towards that self-compassion, and practice that. As we start building our resilience, we'll start recognizing the resilience strategies that we've already been using a long time, but just have not recognized as resilience, so that there can be empowerment in the journey to well-being. And lastly, we have the spiritual elements of what we've talked about today. And this is the last two chakras, Ajna and Sahasrara, third eye and crown chakra, which correspond to spiritual soul elements and highlight a lack of trust in one's ability to be witnessed and be all that one is. Trust needs to be built by receiving the appropriate guidance, which allows us awareness of our own healing journey and the experiences and connections of others who have also experienced similar pain, similar struggles, similar resilience strategies, and bringing us together so that we can use a holistic way of working with South Asian survivors, which is actually just all we're asking for. So I would just like to thank you all for sharing space with me. This has been really beautiful to be able to share this work that I'm deeply passionate about with you all. It's exciting to be using my voice as a survivor in this space and really advocating for my fellow survivors. And just a reminder that my perspective, this framework, is drawn from Sanatana Dharma, which is the actual name of Hinduism. And you know, that's my perspective. It's one perspective, and it might not work for everybody, but it's important to learn about and not push this on anybody or everybody, because different survivors will have different experiences and different needs. So this is really just a stepping stone to get into this work. But I encourage you all to take control of your own learning and do your research, talk to as many people as you can, find resources to really solidify your understanding, but also have this awareness that you won't know it all. There is no way for us to be culturally competent. Embrace cultural humility and have that willingness to be open and share power with the people that you work with so that you can learn from them. And at the end of the slide, I have put in a video that you can learn more about the chakras, and it relates it back to a number of different psychology theories. And the article which talks about the different laws, spiritual laws, which govern the chakras, as well as a list of references. Yeah, so I'll stop sharing that screen now. And hey, awesome. Well, again, just wanting to thank you all. And I really appreciate you all being here. You'll be getting a copy of the presentation so you can have a read through, because I appreciate that this is big and you can't just cover it in 2 hours. I mean, for me, this is my life. I've grown up with this culture and I'm still always learning. So embrace cultural humility and just come back to these slides again and again when you need to. But you can follow my work if you would like to, or send me an email, send me a message, but that's all in the slide. So thank you. If anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can pop it in the reflections, in the chat box, sorry, and I will give you a few moments before I will close off our session with a mantra, and just bring us all back into the space that we've shared together. Oh, you're all so welcome. Thank you for giving me this space to use my voice. Nose in the break. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have very many questions. So let's move towards wrapping up our space and closing off this container that we've been learning in. So I again invite you to bring your awareness to your seat and possibly closing or lowering your eyes and just taking a few deep breaths here if this feels accessible for you today. Loka samastaha sukhino bhavantu. Loka samastaha sukhino bhavantu. Loka samastaha sukhino bhavantu. Om Shanti. Shanti, Shanti. And when you feel ready, gently fluttering your eyes open and coming back to the space. And so that was just a little meditation, a little mantra, which translates roughly to may all beings everywhere be happy, healthy and free. Thank you.